COVID-19, George Floyd, Donald Trump, Joe Biden, cancel culture. 2020 is a mess. It's convention season. Our president is presently calling on Americans to boycott Goodyear tires. And here in sunny California, we're now talking about fire tornadoes, where apparently the fire has now merged with the sky. So make of that what you will. With the whole world divided along party lines on just about everything, if you're a marketer, it is very difficult as you struggle to navigate this culture war where it seems like at every step there are new landmines. If that sounds familiar, you've come to the right place. Welcome to Oxford Road Presents The Divided States of Media. I'm your host, Dan Granger, CEO and founder of Oxford Road. The purpose of our program here is to help brands particularly find real solutions to the complexities for brands and media reaching out to a divided nation. Are we part of the problem? Can we be part of the solution? Think of this podcast as a starting point, and we're on a path here alongside our partners at the National Institute for Civil Discourse. We're beginning with a conversation, but we're going to end with action, so stay with us over the next few months. Our aim is simple: to engage leaders in media, marketing, and companies large and small in the preservation of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness by bringing unity to these divided states of media. Our guest today is Neil Simon. In 2018, Neil was an independent candidate for the U.S. Senate seat in Maryland. He was unaffiliated with any political party, which is a very bold thing to do. He ran to unite the country and to bring pragmatism back to Washington. A true believer in people over politics, Neil authored the book Contract to Unite America, which we're going to talk about today. It provided specific practical solutions for an improved government and a better tomorrow. Now, before seeking office, Simon was also CEO of Bronfman Rothschild and previously of Highline Wealth Management. Simon also serves on the boards of the Bipartisan Policy Center, Stand Up Republic, and Unite America. Welcome, Neil. Thanks for being with us.
Great to be with you, Dan.
It's good to talk to you again. Do you mind just setting the stage for us a little bit about your background and how you went and got mixed up in all of this bipartisan work that you're doing?
Sure. So my background is really as a business person. So like you, I've run a few different companies. The most successful one was one of the ones you mentioned that I grew over a number of years, and ultimately we managed about $6.5 billion and employed 100 people and had 21 offices. And I sold that business a few years ago. And during my whole career, I was very interested in politics, very interested in policy. And like most Americans, had different issues that were important to me. And I would find that time and time again, our government would get nothing done on any of those important issues. So whether it was immigration or healthcare costs or a changing climate or a spiraling debt, we never got anything done. And I grew increasingly frustrated. And it was really out of that and out of a desire to have our government function better that I started to get involved in politics and began to get affiliated with some of the bipartisan and nonpartisan groups that you mentioned, and ultimately decided to run for the United States Senate.
So tell us more about that. What is it like being a candidate for something as high profile and important as the Senate as a candidate that's not a Republican or a Democrat?
So running unaffiliated with any party is really, really hard. So you start off with no natural allies. The political system has really been rigged in a way to benefit people who are willing to appeal to the base of one party or the other. And a lot of the rules have been changed over the last few decades to make that even more the case. And so the easy path to victory, if you want to get into politics and want to run, is pick a team. Put on a blue jersey, put on a red jersey, appeal to one of those bases, go through the primary system, and compete that way. It's much, much easier to do that than to try to do what I did. So I ran as a pragmatic independent, unaffiliated from either party. And we ended up doing better than any unaffiliated candidate in the country. I had pulled as high as 18%. We ended up finishing a bit lower than that. But it is difficult because the deck is stacked against you. It starts with the way ballot access works and getting your name on the ballot and debates, the way money works in politics, the way districts are drawn, the way primaries work, and really almost every aspect of the electoral system is stacked against somebody running outside of that duopoly.
So, one of the things we're really focused on here is the consequences of being so polarized, right? And what you're describing is specific to politics, and what it sounds like is it adds up to us being ineffective and even maybe more inefficient than most people realize in how we do the nation's business. But is that correlated to all of the hate and all of the judgment and all of the stone throwing that we're seeing? I mean, things are getting increasingly contentious. As you know, how do those two things interrelate?
So one way to ask the question is, are we so divided as a country? Are our people so in opposition, and do they really have such dramatically different views on all of these different issues? Is it coming from the population? Or is the population really not that divided? And what we have are leaders and a media that you bring up, Dan, that's plays a huge role in this,
right?
That are doing a lot to divide a group of people that might not otherwise be as divided. And I think it's the latter. When I campaigned, I met tens of thousands of people in Maryland. And I will tell you that, yes, there's 10% that fall into the far left and have pretty extreme views on things. And there's another 10% on the far right. But the overwhelming majority of Americans and the overwhelming majority of the people in my state fall into what one study called the hidden majority. And they're frustrated with this, and they want a government that functions better. They want us to come together. They want leaders that truthfully and honestly can unite the country. And I think they're starved for it. Now, our political system does not allow those type of candidates to succeed because, again, the path to victory is going through one of those two 10%. But I think that the country is starved for unity, and that it's really political leaders who benefit from appealing to bases that do a lot to divide us, and then the media plays a big role in exacerbating it. And then social media plays a role as well.
So when you look at all the potential culprits who are kind of like, Don King teeing us up and then pushing us into the ring, right? I mean, your opinion, it sounds like, is that it starts with media and politicians. It's not so much special interests. It's not corporations. It's not the education system. It really starts with media and the people that are in Washington. Is that what you're saying?
Well, the special interests and the corporations play a critical role as well, because the politicians are responding to them. So they do have an ability to influence this. For example, I am a person who believes deeply in the private sector. I've run a few companies. I believe that America benefits from having companies create jobs and drive our economic growth and cause a lot of the innovation that happens in this country. But I also happen to be somebody who thinks climate change is real, and that, we should probably be thinking about that and doing something about it. And so during my campaign, I would get forms from PACs asking me to check a line of boxes. So a conservation group might ask me to check one column, and the US Chamber of Commerce might ask me to check the opposite column. Well, I'm not really able to check all the boxes in either column because I have nuanced views on some of these issues. And so for someone like me, there's basically no money there. So the way the money works, and the special interest money, as you say, and a lot of corporate money works, is pick a side, move to an extreme. And it's not just the special interest and corporate money, it's big, wealthy, ideologically driven donors that are blatantly overrepresented in the process. And so that does also play a big role. That has a massive influence on the behavior of our lawmakers.
Can you give an example of that? Like, what is something that affects how we live as a byproduct of like one billionaire's passion about a topic? Can you think of anything?
So I think you can, the Koch brothers are the kind of big example that people point to on the right, and probably George Soros on the left. And now they're both, I have to say, evolving as donors. Obviously, one of the Koch brothers has passed away, but both the Koch network as well as Soros and their affiliates are evolving. And I actually think they're beginning to understand that some of what they've done in the past has had a destructive impact on our politics, and that it's pitted us against each other. So things are evolving, but in both those cases, there have been funding for initiatives that were largely appealing to the two extremes of the political spectrum.
Neil, I want to hear more about the contract to unite America. It's ambitious, it's aggressive, but can you just at least give us a cursory understanding of what it is and what's included?
One of the disappointments from my campaign was the realization that if you're really running because you think it makes sense for us to come together and solve problems, it's really difficult. The incentive structure is not there for politicians. So what the 10 reforms in my book are about are changing that incentive structure that politicians have. So it crosses, 2 of the 10 reforms are about money in politics. 6 of them are about electoral reforms, things like opening our primaries and the way we draw district lines and using ranked choice voting, for example. And then the last 2 are about how we govern once people are elected. So those 10 reforms collectively, none of them are a silver bullet alone. So there's not one reform that is going to fix the whole system, but collectively, or even if we just were able to pass a few of them, I think it would have a big impact on that incentive structure that makes our politicians, care so much about winning the daily news cycle, care so much about appealing to their base and belittling the other side and demonizing the other side, rather than working together for the good of our country.
And how much resistance is there with all of the incumbents on? I mean, that may be the one thing that they can all unite on, right? Is hang on to the power. So tell us about what it's like. It feels very David versus Goliath. What is that like being on the other side of?
So first of all, every one of the 10 reforms in my book is supported by over 60% of Americans. The most popular one is term limits.
Is that relevant?
Right. The most popular one is term limits at 83%, and then campaign finance reform comes next. And the reason it's relevant is that the group of Americans who do not support these reforms are largely the people you're asking about, or largely are currently elected officials who benefit from the game with the rules the way it is played today, right? So a lot of people think the word bipartisan is always a good thing. Hey, if both parties agree to it, it must be good. But I think about things a little bit differently sometimes. We basically have a duopoly for our government. We have 2 parties that control our political industry. And in corporate America, there are antitrust laws, and there would be people keeping an eye on that behavior. In the political world, there are no antitrust laws. And the 2 parties, the duopoly, basically govern themselves. So for each of the 10 reforms, you're almost always fighting both parties. Or what happens is, like for gerrymandering, for example, my state, Maryland, is arguably the worst gerrymandered state in the country. We happen to be gerrymandered by a Democratic legislature. So in my state, the Democrats are the gerrymanderers. In Texas or in Wisconsin or North Carolina, the Republicans have done the gerrymandering. So a lot of times it's the entrenched party who's benefiting from the abuse of the rules that is fighting everything tooth and nail. But the good news is we are making progress on a number of these initiatives in different states around the country.
So you're seeing progress. I mean, what does it take to actually break through with them? Does it all start grassroots, or, does something radical need to happen in the country to make way for it? Like, what is the path to real change on this stuff?
In 2018, we were able to have 23 ballot initiatives passed to reform rules in different states. So in about half the states in this country, you can change the way elections work, for example, by having citizens actually vote directly on a ballot initiative. So for example, in 2018 in Michigan, the citizens voted to have an independent commission draw their congressional lines. So they made political gerrymandering a thing of the past. In Maine, the voters chose to implement ranked choice voting in 2018. There were a number of campaign finance reforms passed at the state level. In 2020, we had hoped to have about 45 initiatives on the ballot. It's going to end up being a lower number because it's very difficult to get these things on the ballot during a pandemic because you need signatures on petitions to get them on the ballot. But there'll be a number of other changes as well in Alaska, Florida, and other states. So the way this kind of change happens is largely modeled on the progressive era of 100 years ago. So what happened 100 years ago is you started to have change at the local level, anti-corruption laws, a lot of movement on women's right to vote, the direct election of representatives, and it passed the state level, and then gradually it crescendoed into national change, and you end up with 2 amendments at that time, the one that gave women the right to vote, and a second one that gave all of us the ability to elect our senators directly. They used to be elected by state legislatures. And so you went through a 20-year period where things crescendoed into national change. And I think we need that now because the system we have is naturally going to get more and more polarized. It's a function of the way our elections work and the way our districts are drawn, and we allocate representatives, and there's political science on this. We naturally end up with a 2-party system, and we naturally will get more and more polarized. So it is not going to solve itself, this problem. It is dependent upon all of us to embrace our democracy and realize that it's our democracy, that we need to do something about it. We need to try to form a more perfect union, and that's what it will take, more and more people getting involved. There are a lot of people involved already, but we need more.
So Neil, I want to bring this to think about the real impact. So, you know, when you've got something like, if you're talking about crime legislation, or you're talking about climate change, and you're talking about, you know, potentially life and death, right? With it, when you talk about gerrymandering, it sounds very different, right? Like you have to make a couple cognitive leaps here. What happens if we just stay on the path that we are on? Paint a picture for me about what's actually at stake here.
So a lot of times when I talk to groups, I will ask people to think about what are the 2 or 3 most important political issues on their mind. And I'll pause. And I'll let people really get a couple of things on their mind. And people will often say things like healthcare costs or education for our kids, or maybe climate change, which you just brought up. During my election, immigration was a big one. And then I'll ask them, so how much progress have we made on that issue in the last couple of decades? And inevitably, the answer is 0. I mean, you can list the top 10 challenges that we're facing as a nation, and we've basically made 0 progress on all of them. And I'll say, well, why do you think that is? And if we're talking about immigration, for example, there have been 3 moments in time when there was fairly obvious bipartisan comprehensive legislation that should have been passed. But in all 3 times, it was upended by one party or the other who didn't want to have to go back to their bases and say, I agreed to something where the other side got even just a little. Right? So it fell apart. And it's the same with every one of these big issues. We have lost our ability to compromise. That's become a dirty word. And instead, our legislators are worried about being primaried, right? Losing in a primary to a more extreme representative. And so the way it impacts all of us is on every one of these issues, we make no progress. Immigration, we've had no reform. Climate change, we're doing very little. Our debt just goes up and up because it's so much easier just to spend the money and not make any tough choices. And we are gradually becoming less competitive economically. We're also becoming dysfunctional as a society, and it breaks my heart, right? And that's part of what motivated me to get involved in all these organizations, get involved in nonpartisan politics, and then ultimately run for office.
So I talked to you offline a little bit about the new documentary Stars and Strife that came out. But one of the things that I think people bring up from time to time is that empires usually have about a 250-year shelf life, right? And our expiration date may be coming up. Do you buy into that? Is it really getting that dire with how divided we are that the whole system may crack?
I'm an optimist.
Yeah.
So I think that we will come around, but it often takes a moment when people really realize deeply, profoundly, that the system itself is broken. So right now, all of our political energy as a country, almost all of it, is being poured into this November election.
Right.
And, there's a chunk of the country that feels like as long as Trump's reelected, everything's going to be fine. There's a chunk of the country that feels like, God, replace him with anyone and we'll be fine.
Right.
And the question I ask people sometimes is, do you really think we're going to become more functional and address those top 10 issues we just talked about if Trump wins or if Trump loses? Do you think all of a sudden we will have constructive legislation coming out of Congress? No, no one thinks that. It's just getting worse and worse. An example I point to sometimes is the confirmation process in the Senate, because it just is so illustrative of how bad things have gotten. Anthony Kennedy was appointed by Ronald Reagan and was confirmed by the Senate with 96 votes. A few years later, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was appointed by Bill Clinton, now a Democrat instead of a Republican, and she was confirmed with 97 votes. Today, confirmation hearings, not just for justices, but for cabinet officials, are largely party line votes. Again, I think because we no longer have any reason, the congressmen no longer have any reason to sort of work together, support each other. They're more worried about the base of their parties. And so it's going to get worse and worse. More and more Americans are realizing this, more and more Americans realizing that the problem, and you're right, it feels esoteric to talk about gerrymandering. It feels esoteric to talk about campaign finance reform. How does that matter for me? Well, the reason it matters for me and for you and for anyone watching this is that for the issues you care about, we're going to get nothing done until our government becomes more functional.
Okay, this is great. And I want to move us over to things that are a little more in the weeds for professionals that are trying to, work through how they communicate from, it's part of it's about being a citizen, but also there's a piece about being a corporate citizen. And what does that mean if you're a brand or leading a business or a media company? And before that, we're going to play the unsolicited advice game, which is going to be a lot of fun. But the first thing I need to do is I need to ask the audience to help me out with something that's very important to me. One of the great tragedies of the pandemic, in addition to the loss of life and so many businesses and things like that, is just the feeling of isolation that so many people have. And, even when they're trying to connect with all the divisions, so many people are just feeling alone and isolated. This feeling of isolation is something that happens every day and has always happened and continues to happen at children's hospitals across America. You oftentimes have children with life-threatening illnesses alone in bed and nobody to comfort them despite world-class medical care and devoted parents. Nobody can be there all the time, and nobody can hire enough support staff to take care of these kids. When our youngest daughter was born, she was in Children's Hospital for about 6 months, and we were there almost all the time. But, when we couldn't be there, it was one of the most miserable experiences of my life. And seeing all the kids who might have single parents, it's devastating. And so my wife and I agreed that we were going to do something to take action to make an impact on this. And we started something called the Koala Core, whose mission is to bring hands to hold every child in need. So remember, there are enough volunteers that actually want to be involved in this. The problem is hospitals don't have the funds to coordinate, manage, facilitate. And so we're raising money that goes specifically to the hospital, specifically for that purpose. And I just want to ask that if you're in a place to contribute to that, we don't actually touch the money. All the money goes directly to Children's Hospital. We just ask that you go to koalacore.com, KOALACORPS.com, and do what you can to help us out. So if you like what we're doing here, please subscribe on iTunes to our podcast, or Spotify, or wherever you get your shows. Also, please visit oxfordroad.com to subscribe to The Influencer, which is our weekly newsletter for industry updates and thought leadership. Okay, let's come back to you now, Neil, for the unsolicited advice game. You're going to get, now remember, the ground rules are this. We basically give you 20 seconds, which is about how long it would take you to read a tweet. And in that time, you're going to address different constituencies in the country, and I'm going to name them, and then we're going to give you 20 seconds. So are you ready?
Sure.
Okay. Your first address is with President Donald Trump. On your mark, set, go.
President Trump, you need to hit Control Alt Delete and reset. And I think a great way that you can do it is to reconstitute your cabinet. Invite a few Democrats into your cabinet, invite a few independents. Prioritize Democrats and unity over appealing to your base voters.
Very good. Okay, your next one in 20 seconds. Dear Joe Biden, on your mark, set, go.
Vice President Biden, you can do something very similar. If you're elected, you've already chosen your vice president. I wish you would have chosen a vice president from the other party, which John McCain had really regretted not doing. But also with your cabinet, I would love to see you try to truly do something to unify this country. And I think one way to do it is appoint some Republicans, some independents. And I think when you take office, if you take office, the temptation is going to be to move further and further to the left. You're going to get a lot of pressure to do that. Focus instead on unifying the country. We need it.
Okay, very good. Now the next one is going to be tougher. I want you to talk to people that are marketers, people that are talking to the public and getting increasing encouragement to take stands on hot issues. So in 20 seconds, dear marketers, ready, set, go.
I think the marketers in this country need to think about how they can be part of the solution and not part of the problem. And I would encourage them to resist the urge to take a side, to appeal to one ideological extreme in this country, and instead challenge themselves to have unifying messages, to have products that are positioned in a way that they appeal to all Americans. And to the degree they're part of companies that are funding political activities, don't fund candidates, fund political reform that will help us fix the system.
Okay, next one is media. Everybody. What do you say to every member of the media? Ready, set, go.
So the media, first thing you need to do is acknowledge that you're part of the problem. And I understand and appreciate that there are business models in the media world that do better by appealing to bases. I understand that that works well for Fox and CNN and the New York Times and other publications. And I would love to see some of you get together and start something new, something that becomes the go-to objective news source in this country. So I challenge somebody in the media to do that. Put together a group of phenomenal journalists and come up with something that we all can read and agree on that doesn't do so much to split us apart.
We should talk about that. Okay, next up, you're talking to the parties themselves. What do you have to say to the Republicans? Ready, set, go.
So first thing for Republicans is, hey, Democrats are not evil. They actually want what is best for this country. And I'm going to tell them the same thing about you guys. Republicans. And I think Republicans need to really think about how they can embrace the wonderful diversity of this country and understand that that is really one of our great strengths as a nation. We've had people come from all over the globe and bring innovation and bring energy and bring entrepreneurialism and form the great country that we are today. And I think I'd love to see Republicans really embrace that as part of their message and to put the country over their party's interests.
Mm-hmm. Beautiful. Okay, now the Democratic Party.
So same thing for the Democrats. The first thing they have to understand is Republicans are not evil. Republicans are good people too. And they want what's best for the country. Very often they feel like our government is a little too big and over involved. And I would also encourage the Democrats to put the interests of the country ahead of the interests of their particular party and their particular candidates at that moment.
Very good. Okay, final one is every American.
My message for the country right now is that this is our government. This is our democracy. This is a process that we all own together. How we elect our lawmakers, our executive branch of our government, and how we are governed, that is our responsibility, all of us as voters. And it doesn't have to work the way it works today. It can be a different process that yields better results. So I would encourage all of you to get involved in some of the incredible political reform organizations out there like Unite America and Issue One and Represent Us and others.
Beautiful. Okay, and I have a bonus question for you. It's not a speech. It's there's a curveball. You get to write in one person and they become the next president. Anybody alive today? Who is it?
I'm going to give you more than one answer. So first of all, there are two great, I think, capable unifying politicians in my state, our governor, Larry Hogan, and a former Congressman, John Delaney, who's a Democrat. Hogan's a Republican. I think both very capable executives. Delaney's run a few companies. I also, other names I think about are Amy Klobuchar, John Kasich. I would have loved to have seen any of those folks be on the ballot in November.
So let's move the conversation a little more towards corporations. And I imagine you've been following kind of the evolution of things like the Business Roundtable and the idea of stakeholder capitalism. Do you see that having an impact that is either positive, negative, or both, perhaps, in the way that we are functioning as a society?
So I think there is some impact, but I think it's been modest. You know, with a lot of the initiatives there, a lot of times what we see are publications and statements of principle. I think that's important because it's important to get all of us as a society thinking about the role of business in our society. And I do think that corporate America probably swung a little too far towards a hyper focus on profits and losing sight of the fact that they have a responsibility to other constituencies, to the communities in which their businesses are based, to their customers, not only to their shareholders, obviously to their employees as well. So I do see the dialogue having changed in the last few years, just from the people I know and the conversations I'm part of. And I think that that's having a constructive impact.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm observing is, especially in a year like this, is I see a lot of companies now, and we've seen the study saying that consumers want companies to take a stand, but a lot of times the things they take a stand on may be controversial. And I think what you were saying earlier was that you'd like to see them find unifying causes. And I certainly would too. But I just wonder, like, on one hand, there's this shut up and dribble mentality where it's like, serve your ice cream and save the politics, you know? And then on the other hand, it's like, well, it's your job to save the world. And so do you have any thoughts on where the line is between how involved is appropriate and when they start crossing over and it gets to be a little too far?
And I think we see that. It's an interesting question you asked, Dan, because I think we see it not just with corporate America, but you're starting to see this with celebrities, with athletes.
Yeah.
Everybody's political views are on stage all the time. And part of me wonders, I mean, first of all, do we really care where some of these folks are politically? But it is the world in which we live. In terms of corporate America, I think that taking political stands is not the role of corporate America. I think that considering and valuing different constituencies is part of the role. And so what I mean by that is, if you have a company and you're based in a community and your employees are in that community and you benefit from the schools there and the roads and all the investment that's been made, I do think that that company should feel some obligation to give back to that community in whatever form that can happen. I always did that at my companies, whether it's by encouraging volunteerism among the employee base, whether it's by financial contributions, whether it's by interacting in a constructive way with the local government and forming public-private partnerships to address different issues. I think there are ways for companies to play a constructive role. Where the line gets drawn, and I think where some companies go over the line, is when they're taking blatantly political stands. Especially in a world where, a lot of these things are not as black and white as they're made out to seem on Fox and CNN and on social media. A lot of the issues we confront are more nuanced. And when companies are kind of taking a stand, very often they're buying into this black or white, right or wrong attitude about different issues. And I think that that's not very helpful.
Well, and I wonder, you look at history and we've always had so many divisions. You used to have congressmen caning each other, in the chambers, right? It's like, this isn't new. We had a president who literally got into duels. So like, is it really that different, or has it always been this way and we just are, romanticizing the past? I know I'm switching topics a little bit here, but I do think that's an important question.
No, I think it is different. I really do. Now, you're right. There have been moments in time where we've been very divided, and a lot of people point to the period before and during the Civil War, obviously, as a highly divisive moment in the history of our country. But when you look at statistics on the way people view each other, on the kind of lopsidedness of different districts, we are at a very, very divided moment in our society. And it scares me. That's part of what drove me to write that book, because I think it is more likely to get worse than to get better if we don't do things about it.
Right.
And I think that's part of why you're putting together this great podcast here, is because you're concerned about it. And I think you're right to be concerned. And it's not an easy problem. It's multifaceted. It involves politicians and the government, but it also involves the media that you're focused on. It involves the citizenry and what all of us can do. So it's a complicated problem.
Yeah. So do you mind sharing your thoughts on cancel culture as you understand it? What is it? Does it exist? What do you think about it?
So I think as a society, we have this tendency now to think about almost everything in tweets, in a really limited, simplistic manner, right? Where you're just communicating a few words, a complicated issue, and it's supposed to capture everything, and it's black or white. And there are so few public policy issues that work that way. Even the tough ones, right? Like the Second Amendment and gun violence, right? Like you're either for us or against us, and it's black and white. So and the problem with that is that it leaves out any ability to discuss the nuances of the issue. Well, okay, maybe I kind of believe in somebody's right to bear arms and protect themselves, and the Second Amendment, absolutely. But I am okay if people go through background checks. Like, and then let's talk about different aspects of this in a mature way as a society. And so this whole cancel culture thing and the way this all works on social media, it to me feeds into the oversimplification of every single issue. So he said that, so he must be on the other side of this. So forget that guy. And that's not helping us, right? I think we need more mature dialogue about issues where people are saying, okay, I understand that point of view. I understand that you can't oversimplify COVID and only talk about the COVID cases and the deaths. We have to also think about the economic impact and think about the impact on kids of not being in school and the impact on mental health of people being, home for so long. And let's have that discussion with that nuance. And how are we trading those things off? And let's have public policy be informed and be the result of a mature analytical thought process and not, 32-word tweets.
And do you see any centralized bodies starting to advance that? Like, you think about the change in the country's perspective and involvement on climate. You think about the evolution of how we look at the food that we eat, the way that we get ingredients, what we're putting into our bodies. That kind of stewardship mentality doesn't feel like it's really started to become part of the discussion when it comes to our speech, our communication, our relationships. Do you see anybody doing anything to help that?
Are you talking about the media? You're talking about politicians? You're talking about...
I'm asking any movement of any type specifically devoted to the as you said, like you've said this several times, I think it's a really important point. We've discarded nuance. We have no space for it. It's, it's the sugar water version of communication, right? How do we say something that is emotionally charged, one extreme or another extreme, that's going to shock. It's like we're addicted to getting shocked, right? And I don't see any cultural movement that's starting to bring recognition to that and to push against it, whereas you see infrastructure around it in these other facets of life. And that's where I'm mentioning the environment. I'm mentioning, look at every kind of, type of diet that you can be on, every type of restaurant that will cater to a certain kind of eating. Where is the Whole Foods for communication? Where, is there anybody doing the work that you're seeing from any part of society?
So there are a few groups out there who are trying to encourage civil discourse, who are trying to encourage people to make an effort to understand the opposite side's point of view. So for example, there's a group, last night I did a book event for a group called Braver Angels. And they're a national organization. They bring together groups of people with different political views. They have a structure to the way they conduct their conversations. And it's a pretty amazing group. There's the group you mentioned before, I think your previous guest is part of, right, on civil discourse. So there are groups out there. I think it's, it's a tough challenge. Like, how do you think about it?
How do you put it back in the box, right? Like social media, how do you change the incentive structure for them to put divisive content at the top of your feed? Where does that come from, right? Like, I wonder how much, can you give us any kind of context on how legislation has helped us got here? I know there were a lot of changes with deregulation, with the fairness doctrine kind of going away. What's happened in government that has enabled this wildfire? Like, you have some channels that still have, FCC regulation and you have to say things a certain way. And then you've got the internet, right? And everything else where it just seems like a free for all. Why does it feel like we are not regulating at all? How did we get here?
Well, the challenge here is that you have this temptation to regulate. Hey, let's make sure everybody's telling the truth. Hey, let's not give a megaphone to people who are spreading divisive messages, right? That feels like that makes sense. But there's a flip side of that, which is freedom of speech and freedom of the press. And unless you're willing to limit freedom of speech or freedom of the press, it's a very difficult thing to modify that behavior. And I don't believe in minimizing those rights that we have. I think it's a dangerous slope.
Do you mean that across the board though? Like truly, let me drill in on that with you. Do you really believe that whatever you can find on the internet should be readily available to anyone? Or, because I think everybody draws a line somewhere.
Yeah, no, of course you draw the line with freedom of speech, right? The classic example is you're not allowed to go to a movie theater and yell fire, right? If there's no fire, because you're endangering other people. So there is a line that people cannot cross. But that line is when you're starting to endanger people. That line is not when someone in some capacity, someone in a position of power has been given the authority to say, you're allowed to say this, but not that. Or you're allowed to say it to this audience, but not that audience, right? That's a dangerous game. I think that line has to be pretty far to the point where there's legitimate danger being created, because otherwise you're really, the free speech and freedom of the press are part of what makes our country great. It's not working particularly well at this moment, right? It's being abused by people on the internet. But remember that this whole internet age, this whole social media age is new. We're in the infancy of this era. It is still a relatively new phenomenon in the 240-year history of this country. And I have faith in America. We'll figure out how to moderate that behavior and how to use it more constructively. Listen, it's one of the great disappointments to me when social media started coming and the internet started coming. It was supposed to be this great equalizer, this great channel for people to get equal access to information and ideas and tools. And unfortunately, it's been used perhaps more to divide us and more to disseminate information that is dividing us and making us less functional.
Yeah, I think it whatever the solution is or whatever the solutions are, it seems like it comes down to changing the reward system, right? And one of the things that we run into, because look, I have an ad agency, so we sit in between these companies who are many times struggling to survive or grow, and facing incredible challenges just because they're in business, right? And then we find channels where they can really get customers and advertise effectively that have very loyal audiences. Well, a lot of times those are polarizing figures that produce that. And then you get these other groups coming out of the woodwork, like, folks at Media Matters and Sleeping Giants are the two I usually throw under the bus. But, their whole focus is targeting advertisers of content that they find objectionable, even though there's usually a lot of partisan bias behind that. Do you have an opinion about how to deal with that type of threat when you're a company who's kind of stuck in the middle of all of it?
So what you're talking about is not an objection to the content of the ad. You're talking about objection.
Nothing to do with that. So I'll give you an example.
They're on a program where they object to the content of the program.
Yeah, in 2020, if you have ads on Facebook, if you have ads on Fox News, if you sponsor talk radio, if you're on certain podcasts that are too political, there are brands that if the purpose of this show, which it isn't, was to drive ad revenue for the show, if that was our goal, there are many brands who would not even look at us because we are talking about politics. Doesn't even matter if we're, taking a position on one side or another. It's just some of them throw the baby out with the bathwater. But specifically, and I see this more on the right, where there is infrastructure and machinery designed to torment the sponsors, so they will withdraw support from the content And, hopefully, I think the strategy is like, well, let's see if we can get Tucker Carlson off the air. Let's see if we can go after Ben Shapiro. They usually go after the most successful folks in a channel. But I wonder what you think of that kind of, corporate anarchy. Now that I've said what I think about it.
Right. Well, I think there are two issues here. One is,
Yeah.
should people have the right to do that? And then the second is, what is our judgment of that behavior?
Right.
Objective judgment of that behavior.
Right.
On the first question, I think clearly people should have the right to do that. If they want to use their free speech rights, if they want to use their money to promote different messages, I think that that's their right, if they want to spend their time doing that. Now, should they do it, and are they doing something that's constructive for America? I could probably argue either side of that, actually. On the one hand, if you believe that some of these media outlets are contributing to the problem, and those media outlets feed off of those ad dollars that they might be deprived of because of what some of these folks are doing, you kind of sympathize with it a little bit. But the other part of me says, really? That's how you're spending your time and your resources and your money? Like, don't you have something better to do?
We had Adam Carolla on last season, and he said the exact same thing, maybe with a little harsher language, but yeah.
I ran for office. I have to be a little polished.
Yeah, no, I hear you. No, and look, I look at it the same way, which is I don't think they shouldn't be allowed to do that. But I think the notion of it is constructive, but the application of it is not. It's like what we see in politics, right? If you want to advance your ideas, I hope we have a forum to do that and to debate it, and theoretically the best idea should triumph, right? But instead we get into this shame cycle where, like, you have a group who is literally pulling sound bites, oftentimes kind of twisting them to insinuate a meaning that they may not actually mean, pushing it out on social media, and everybody starts, banging their pitchforks and, getting ready to attack and call out the sponsors who really aren't trying to take a position on that stuff. And they're doing this if-then logic that's like, oh, your ad fell on Fox News. Therefore, you are effectively Donald Trump and responsible for everything he says and does. And so they get called out, and you're a brand, you're not looking for that kind of attention. So what are you supposed to do? And we find ourselves in the middle of that all the time. It's a very frustrating situation because it doesn't quite feel like a fair playing field. And, one of the things we're trying to do in this process with this show and with our work with the NICD is just try to figure out, like, how do we create some form of a due process so that it isn't like soundbite occurred, therefore we react and permanently separate and part company between sponsor and media, but how can we constructively engage and go symptom, we're going to take this information and we're going to explore and have a conversation that may have consequences to it, it may not, but isn't so binary, right? And that's what we're trying to get at here. But I'm not seeing, from a media standpoint, I'm not seeing a lot that's being done toward that end.
Right. There are probably two angles to that problem. So the problem we're talking about is a media that is fueling some of the division in our society.
Right.
And how do you deal with that? And you're talking about the concept of dealing with it by attacking the money that the media outlets are getting, by going to their sources of funding and minimizing some of that and having an impact. The other way to do it is to go to the consumers of that media, to go to Americans. And you and I talked earlier about how important it is for us to be better consumers of the news.
Yeah, you're leading right into it. I was going to ask you about, media consumption. Like, what's your media consumption diet? And I do want you to talk about that, please.
Yeah. So, well, I'll get to my personal media consumption diet in a second, but okay. I think just to kind of elaborate on this idea of Americans being better consumers of the news. I used to run an investment firm. We had over 100 people, and including a number of analysts. And occasionally we'd have televisions on in our office with investment programs. Guys on television talking about what stock to buy, what stock to sell. everyone in my company knew that using any of that information to make investment decisions was a terrible idea, because they understand that that is entertainment. It is not analysis, right? We understood that Jim Cramer is entertainment. It's not deep analysis. We need Americans to understand that Fox and CNN are entertainment. They are the equivalent of Jim Cramer. They are not real analysis. And I think it starts there, but the country just needs to really, become better consumers of the news. In terms of my personal news, what do you call it? My news diet?
Your media diet, we'll call it that.
My media diet. I generally start with the feeds to the news. So I look at AP and Reuters and CNBC. And then every day I get an email called The Flip Side, which has an issue, and it says from the left and from the right, and it takes one issue and gives you both sides.
I'll need to sign up for
sources.
that. Yeah.
There's a group called All Sides. But, I'll still read some of the major publications also. But my rule is, if I read one from the left, I got to read the other one from the right. Or if I watch 20 minutes of Fox, I watch 20 minutes of CNN. I always.
It's a miserable existence, isn't it?
It is. No, really. To be kind of an objective, pragmatic, independent is so hard. It takes so much work, because it's so much easier just to turn on one station, to buy into the blue story or the red story, just re-spout whatever they're saying and move on. It's much less time consuming, and it takes much less intellectual energy. It is brutally difficult to do what I think a lot of Americans do, which goes back to the idea I was talking about before. It would be great. It might not be practical, but if somebody created something new that the whole country, red and blue, would buy into as an objective news source.
So I know we're coming toward the end here. I think a lot of people are feeling the kinds of things we're talking about, and they don't know exactly what to do in this upcoming presidential election, being the Super Bowl or the Olympics of elections, right? So what advice do you have for voters who are sick of the venom and sick of the polarization? But here we are with this duopoly, as you've described. What do we do?
So I think the first thing we have to realize is November's election is not going to solve it. No matter who you vote for, it's not going to solve any of this, right? So if people really want to address that venom, if they really want to address the dysfunction, if they really want to create a government that will actually deal with some of the big issues we were talking about at the outset, they need to start thinking about different political reforms and getting involved and supporting those and voting for them when they're on the ballot in their states. And there are some this cycle. And it's everything from gerrymandering to campaign finance reform to opening primaries to enacting ranked choice voting in the few states where that's on the ballot. And they all play a really important role. So I think it's this shifting of a mindset from whether it's the red team or the blue team in power, that really isn't going to make a big long-term difference. What's going to make a long-term difference is changing the way this game is played, so we do better as one red, white, and blue team.
So, in addition to going and purchasing a contract to Unite America, is there an offshoot of that, an extension that helps you apply? Let's say I sign up. I go, I'm for everything you're suggesting, right? Is there a voter's guide or some resource that helps you put that into action?
So in the book, I talk about a number of the reform organizations that are out there. Mm-hmm. And some of the answer depends on where your listeners live and which issues they're involved with. Like, so for example, if somebody wants to work on ranked choice voting, mm-hmm. And there's a ballot initiative in Alaska this cycle, there's a group called Fair Vote that's working on that. If they're more interested in campaign finance reform, there's a group called American Promise that's doing phenomenal work and getting a lot done. Two of the broader reform organizations are called Unite America mm-hmm. and Represent Us. Mm-hmm. And they've got thousands and thousands of members now, people who agree with me that we need to kind of fix the system as a starting point, but we need it to be hundreds of thousands or millions to really affect the type of change that we want.
Yeah. Okay. Any final messages you want to get out there? Thoughts, recommendations, just closing arguments here.
Listen, I know your audience is more marketers,
Mm-hmm.
and, but I think more about the American citizenry and what we can do. And my message is: this is our government, this is our country, our democracy, our democratic republic, and the onus is on us to make it work better. And it really takes each of us playing a role in that. And it can be a small role, but I just encourage people to think very seriously about, is the system working well? How can we make it better? What do they believe in? And do something, because it's not going to get better on its own.
Final question, Neil. Are we going to see you run again?
I have no plans to run again.
No plans? All right. Well,
No.
we'll try to draft you in some form or fashion. We all need the help, but thank you for the work you're doing. Thanks for continuing to push and to fight. It's thankless work, and but it's an important battle. It's a noble cause. So thank you for spending this time with us.
Really appreciate it, Dan. Thanks for what you're doing. It's so wonderful you're putting together this podcast and focusing on this issue and bringing it to people's attention. So thanks.
Thank you. It's just a step, So thanks again. We will continue the conversation with you, Neil. Make sure you go out. Don't go anywhere. Go to Amazon or wherever you get your books and get the contract to Unite America. It's important stuff. And remember that this show is dedicated to the notion of e pluribus unum, out of many one. We believe that we can work through our differences without deepening divides, and we value welcoming perspectives that are different from our own. Thank you for joining us as we go on the long journey here and the road to recovery and sustainable discourse. As always, if you found this helpful, please subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your shows, and visit oxfordroad.com to subscribe to our weekly newsletter, The Influencer. And also thank you to Bianca, Kyle, Jennifer, and the team at WIT for making this happen. And if you take anything out of this, I think, to boil it down, pay attention to the nuance. Just allow for some nuance. Things aren't all black and white. Enjoy the rest of your week.